Okay, I think we can begin. We're good to go. Keep a place in your heart for this human today. He's going into surgery. Are you open to seeing the world from a different perspective? Even if that means walking out of here believing less than you do now? This talk isn't the truth. It's my attempt to explain my perspective to myself in a way that might be useful to others. Whenever I say you in this talk, I'm referring to me. Naturally, there'll be a lot of omissions and many simplifications. Take what appeals to you, leave the rest. I'll be uploading the notes. Say I have some information, an idea that I want to tell you about. I translate the idea into words. I say the words, you hear them, you translate them back into an idea, into a concept. We do it all the time. That's what we're doing here at YAPSI. And it works, except maybe not as well as we like to think. I may struggle to pick words and sentences that convey the idea accurately. And even if I do that well, a lot of detail and nuance is lost. I'm picking words and forming sentences based on my interpretation of the meaning of those words. The words I pick are based on my perspective, my worldview, my biases, my baggage, my frame of reference. But that's not clear to you, the listener. You don't know my frame. You hear the words I've spoken and unpack them into concepts based on your interpretation of the words, your perspective, your worldview, your baggage, your frame of reference. Your understanding of the information that I'm trying to convey is inevitably influenced by your beliefs. It's built into the very process of communication. It's like a very lossy image compression algorithm, but you, the listener, don't notice because of the detail that you add into the image as you reconstruct it. We both believe the information has been shared, but we can't be sure. I might ask you if you've understood, and you'll say yes, because you believe you have. This is happening all the time, even as you listen to me now. So always be doubtful of your understanding. Hold it lightly. Be aware that it's always reflecting your own beliefs. So here's an exercise for you. While you're listening to this talk, you're bound to have thoughts like, oh, he's talking about X, or X is some label. Try to stay aware of your thoughts enough to notice when that happens, and to notice two things in particular. Firstly, what it feels like as the thought arrives. A sense of solving a puzzle, winning a prize, a sense of gaining something. And secondly, notice any baggage that comes with that label, X, whatever it is. Notice any thoughts and feelings that arise in your awareness just after the, oh, he's talking about X thought. Now let's look at what happens when I try to share something more subtle, like a sensory experience, perhaps the look of an exotic butterfly, the feel of a fabric, the taste of a food, the sound of some music. In order to communicate the experience, first I have to conceptualize it, and I will struggle to form accurate concepts of my experience. And no matter how well I do that, detail and nuance is lost. Then there are all the problems of communicating the concepts that I've outlined before. And again, more detail and nuance is lost. You'll form your conceptual version based on your own understanding of the words you hear. And those concepts may evoke experiences in you. But what you experience isn't what I experienced. What you experience is a patchwork of your own experiences, and possibly not even appropriate ones, depending on how you've interpreted the words I've used. Technically, this is known as the explanatory gap. Similes and metaphors and art and poetry help us paper over the gap, but usually we don't even notice the gap is there. Imagine you're eating some of your favorite chocolate. Try to recall the actual experience. How would you express that experience to somebody who has never eaten chocolate? Try it now, in your own mind. You might be choosing some words and phrases to describe the color, the smell, the bite, texture, melting, flavors. But can you see how each of those words and phrases is a label, a symbol, a vast simplification that falls far short of the actual experience? And yet it's that very simplification, that abstraction, which enables effective thinking and communication. Or at least appears to. So when someone tries to share their experience with you, any experience, including this talk, always be doubtful of your understanding. Hold it lightly. be aware that it's a reflection of your own experiences. All knowledge, all beliefs exist within a frame of reference. Knowledge seems absolutely true only to the extent that we're incapable of stepping outside the frame of reference in which it's based. You'd probably agree that I'm stationary now, pretty much. It's obvious, it's self-evident. So you'd disagree with me if I said I was travelling at 300 miles per second. Clearly I'm wrong and possibly crazy. I am stationary. You are stationary, that's true. Yet it's also true that we're moving at over 700 miles an hour on the Earth as it spins. It's also true that we're moving at 67,000 miles an hour as we orbit the Sun, at 450,000 miles an hour as we orbit the Milky Way, and at 1.3 million miles an hour relative to the cosmic background radiation. Each of those speeds is absolutely true for a certain viewpoint, perspective, frame of reference. When you're open to doubting your current perspective, when you hold it lightly, it's easier to see others. What are you taking for granted? What views do you hold about yourself and others and the world around you that are so obvious to you, so self-evident that you don't notice them? It's hard to tell, isn't it? They form what I call your frame of reference, the frame through which we interpret the world. And if you're not aware of them, then you're not aware of how they're influencing your experience and understanding of the world. You've probably had the experience of discussing something with someone, perhaps arguing about it, only to discover there's been a misunderstanding about the words used or the circumstances around the issue. You've had different frames of reference. How often have you had an argument about something where you've had different frames of reference without realizing it? Ultimately, everybody's frame of reference is different. Everybody's experience is different. And this is beautifully summed up by the phrase, no two people ever read the same book. Yet it's amazing how often we argue over whether a book is good or bad, as if there's some universal frame. It is what it is. Our judgment of it is our own. My perspective shifted a few years ago, and the funny thing about a change in perspective is that nothing changes, and yet the experience of everything changes. So this whole talk comes out of my fascination with the idea of how I'd explain this to myself, and the discovery of how incredibly difficult it is. Our senses only pick up a tiny, tiny fraction. Oop, I skipped a slide there. Go back. Our senses only pick up a tiny, tiny fraction of the reality that surrounds us, reducing it into patterns of low bandwidth signals that are further degraded as they travel along the nerves. And even with this reduction, our brain is immersed in a flood of sensory information. In some way that's not understood, these simple signals entering the brain are processed, filtered, and reconstructed into the apparent technicolor world of our day-to-day experience. Or qualia, it's a technical term. The mystery surrounding this process is known as the hard problem of consciousness. Our awareness is immersed not in the outer reality, but in our reconstructed experience. Color, for example, is an illusion. We reason about and act upon this reconstructed experience. For most animals, that boils down to deciding friend or foe, meal or mate. As humans, we operate at a higher level, hopefully. I want to touch upon two particular aspects of experience, habituation and labeling. Habituation is a fancy word meaning getting used to things, getting used to what's normal. Tuning out the normal lets the mind focus its attention, limited attention, on what's unusual, abnormal, on the differences. This is a simple yet powerful mechanism wired deep into all organisms. You're probably familiar with the example of boiling a frog slowly. We can get used to almost anything. We already have. Personally, socially, culturally, we are deeply habituated into our experience. Another way to say it is that we're conditioned by our parents, by our habits, by our peers, our society, culture. The catch here is that almost by definition, it's really hard to be aware of the conditioning. It's become part of our frame of reference. Habituation stems the flood of sensory input, filtering it down to just things we notice. The next step is to reduce the noticed experiences to labels: friend, foe, meal, mate, partner, chair, house, tree. These are concepts, symbols which we've linked to words in our language. And with them we can talk about trees without having to have an actual tree here. Labels are an essential raw material for higher level thinking, learning and communication. Yet they're also abstractions, isolating us from the actual experience, the actual tree. And because our attention can move so easily between the concept of a tree and the experience of a specific tree, we rarely notice the emptiness of the abstractions and symbols we're thinking with. In order to label something, we have to categorize it to decide what label to apply. We have to judge it to form an opinion. So our thinking and speaking are streams of categorization, polarization, judgment, labeling. This is necessary and normal. So of course, we're rarely aware of it. Hot, cold, right, wrong, terrorist, freedom fighter, liberal, conservative. Between pairs is a range, and the middle ground is nuanced and much harder to label. Our mind wants to assign labels for thinking and communication, so we naturally tend towards using the clear labels at the extremes. Once again, detail and nuance is lost. To have an experience, any experience, we have to be consciously aware of it. But what is consciousness? What is awareness? No one knows, so let's try a simpler question. What is the experience of awareness? Can we be aware of being aware? I tend to think of awareness as being like a very wide floodlight, softly illuminating everything you're aware of. Not just sights, but sounds, thoughts, feelings, everything that's in our awareness. Attention is a word we use to refer to awareness when it's more concentrated, like the beam of a torch focusing on one particular thing. And I'm sure you've noticed that the more intensely you pay attention to something, the less aware you are of everything else. So let's do a simple exercise in awareness, because you can appreciate now it's so important to experience things for yourself. Place your attention on the feeling coming from your left foot. The feel of your shoe, warmth, some tingling maybe. Without moving or thinking about your foot, just simply be with it with a quiet mind. Try it now. What you're paying attention to is your left foot. What you're paying attention with is something else. We'll do it again, but this time, after a few seconds, I'll say something to prompt some thinking. And I want you to notice what happens to your attention when you start thinking. So pay attention to your foot again, with a quiet mind. 7 times 12. Did you notice your attention move away from your foot? Yeah, the focus of your attention can't be on your foot and a thought at the same time. You need to be, your full attention can't be on a thought and something else at the same time. You need to be aware of the thought. So awareness is different to thinking. Awareness is primary. Thinking, feeling, seeing, and every other kind of experience are secondary. They are only known within your awareness. So what? Why am I talking about all this conscious aware space stuff? Well, becoming more aware of our awareness gives us a different perspective on the content and experience of our life. It's easier to see habitual assumptions and biases, so we can choose to question them. It's easier to see the repetitive patterns in our thoughts, so we can take our attention elsewhere. It's easier to find space around powerful feelings and emotions, so they're less likely to overwhelm us. It's easier to have choice in how we respond to life's events, triggers, and challenges. But there's a catch, and it's a big one. As you bring more awareness to your thinking, it's very tempting to start thinking about your thinking, especially when you start to notice how unhelpful most of it is. Your thinking mind will happily analyze and judge your thoughts for you. After all, analyzing and judging is what it does best. It'll happily provide a running commentary on the running commentary that's already in your head. And it would be foolish to assume that your thinking mind would be impartial about its own thoughts. Now, if you want to understand your mind, you need to observe it. Just observing your thoughts without judgment starts to bring about change. A neutral, compassionate perspective acts like a solvent. It seems that within the awareness, a kind of intelligence is at work. Presumably the same kind that manages your blood chemistry or drives your car while you're thinking of something else. I'd like to highlight one pattern of thinking that you may have already noticed. that of wanting things to be different to how they are. This is a structural pattern of thinking that's independent to the actual content of your life. You can always find something you want to be different. Imagine you're having an ordinary day, not particularly good or bad, just typical, your default state. Then a thought enters your mind. I wish I was happier. It could be any similar wanting things to be different to how they are. What's the effect of that thought on your happiness? You get less happy. Isn't that interesting? But note that it's not the thought that has that effect. No, the effect of becoming less happy is from believing the thought, from grabbing the fleeting thought and turning it into an opinion that you hold on to. A belief that becomes part of your frame of reference through which you're continually processing your experience. And of course, with that opinion, with that belief, you will easily find endless confirmation that yes, you wish you were happier. The thought reinforces the belief in a cycle that's hard to break out of. So it helps to try to tease apart the situation from the thoughts you're having about it. In this example, there is no situation. The unhappiness is caused entirely by the thought. Usually, though, there will be some underlying situation that prompts the thought that becomes an opinion that alters your frame of reference, that biases you towards confirmation of the opinion, prompting more thought, and the cycle continues. And usually the web of thoughts that we weave into a story around the situation are the source of much more unhappiness than the situation itself. Now imagine you've been believing a wish things were different thought like that for some time, and then at some point you cease believing it. What's the effect? You get happier. Isn't that interesting? But you see the catch. It's a lot easier to believe a thought than it is to stop believing one. We live in and maintain a bubble of rightness. How many of your opinions do you think are wrong? Probably none. And have you noticed that most of your thoughts arrive with a built-in sense of truth and importance? These processes are so deep and so habitual that we rarely notice them. It's hard to have a clear vantage point to see them at work within us. And that's where the awareness comes in. It gives you a place to observe the mind, stepping out of the cycle of thinking and judgment. I'm not asking you to believe any of this. I'm inviting you to get curious about your own experience of your own life, to practice bringing a non-judgmental awareness to your own inner processes, to begin to see your own frame of reference and how it's continuously influencing your experience, to look deeply into the beliefs that you hold and to question those beliefs and your need for them. And then you can choose to loosen your grip on them so they can loosen their grip on you. Thank you.